Hi there. I'm Polly Hemming, the Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Australia's biggest book club for June 2024. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's about morning tea time, so I hope you have a cup of tea and some Scotch fingers ready to go, or fingers of Scotch if you want to spice things up. For today's chat. To officially begin, I would like to acknowledge that Canberra is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Days and times vary for our webinars, so please visit our website, australiainstitute.org.au, for all details of upcoming webinars. And I would also like to highlight that we can only do the things that we do with the help of our supporters, that's you. And there are just 2 days left for the Australia Institute's end of financial year appeal. So if you like our work and you're in a position to donate, any amount is appreciated. And the link to our website should be in the chat there. I also understand that things are tight at the moment, so I want to emphasise that attending our events, sharing our work, and the positive feedback we get from our supporters is also a really critical act of support. So just a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panellists and you can upvote questions and make comments. So please keep things civil, keep things on topic, or we'll have to kick you out, I'm afraid. This discussion is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today. It's a much needed reality check while the Australian debate, if you can even call it that, has been hijacked by a lot of hysteria about nuclear energy, which, to be clear, is not about nuclear energy. It's not about energy at all. It's about creating political chaos and prolonging fossil fuels. And every day that we spend talking about nuclear is a day that we are not talking about bipartisan support for gas and coal in Australia. It's a day that we're not talking about the billions of dollars of subsidies that go to the fossil fuel industry in Australia. This is the industry that is actually causing the climate crisis, that is causing the biodiversity crisis, that is causing extreme heat, that is causing insurance premiums to rise, that is already killing people and, to be blunt, is going to cripple our economy. So every day, I know I keep talking about nuclear, but every day we talk about nuclear, we're not talking about what the government, the actual government, not the opposition, is doing about climate change. So thank you to everyone who has not been caught up in that distraction. We had over 1,000 registrations for this webinar today. Thank you to everyone who's keeping their eyes on the prize and who is joining us here today. And that seems like an excellent time to introduce today's guest, award-winning climate scientist and the Australia Institute's 2024 Writer-in-Residence, Joëlle Gergis. Joëlle is an internationally recognised expert in Australian and Southern Hemisphere climate variability and change, who has authored over 100 publications, scientific publications, but there's also books in there too. She's the author of 3 books: A Sunburnt Country, The Future and History of Climate Change in Australia, Humanity's Moment, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope, and of course the topic of today's conversation, Highway to Hell. It's such a cheery title, Highway to Hell, Climate Change in Australia's Future. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joëlle. What I'm going to do is hit you with some questions and then we'll open up to the audience questions for a bit of a chat, if that works for you.
Thanks, Polly. It's really great to be here.
So the first thing I want to ask, and this is what strikes me whenever I hear you speak or I read anything of yours, is why are we at the point where climate scientists are having to be policy experts? And by that I mean is that for this essay and for your books, you've had to trawl through policy material to write the essay. You had to analyse the policies that have been proven to work in Australia and in other places. You had to analyse whether Australia's policy response is sufficient. I would have thought that, we don't ask cancer researchers to write health policy. Surely your job stops when you say, hey, governments, climate change is really bad and this is what's causing it. What's gone wrong here?
Yeah, that's a really good question to begin. And I think that for many scientists, we often in the past have felt that if we put our information out there, that it speaks for itself and we don't really have to say anything else. But I guess we're living in an era, when I talk about it in the essay as being the age of consequences. And I guess the traditional role of physical scientists, so people like me that are climatologists or oceanographers, atmospheric scientists, we are really focused on describing those dynamical changes in the climate system. We also look at things like estimating the impacts of climate change, like sea level rise or extreme heat. And these are the sorts of things that you see in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's different volumes, particularly volume 1 and 2. And mitigation, or the solutions to climate change, have been looked at for a long time by the IPCC, but it's in a different working group. It's in working group 3, and that brings in energy experts. And so that's a bit of a different skill set in truth. So those conversations tend to occur in different places. And I guess that's why we often see this clear distinction between climate and energy debates. And maybe that's also why many of us don't feel comfortable talking about policy, because it's not core business for a lot of climate scientists. And obviously, policy is the role of governments, but we're seeing a real failure of our policymakers. It is just that bad now that scientists like me are now having to become engaged in a conversation and wade into political debates that we aren't always equipped to deal with, but because the stakes are so high, I've really actually felt like there isn't an option. And so that's how I've come to be writing this essay.
Yeah, and thank you for writing it. It is very confronting. I know you have to deal with very confronting subject matter generally as a climate scientist. The essay was, to be honest, really hard to read in places, but I didn't put it down feeling despair. I put it down feeling angry, to be honest, because you do present the simple policy solutions, not that you should have to, that governments could implement, have implemented elsewhere, have implemented previously in Australia. And you and I have discussed this recently. This is sort of a comment and a question. We're always told that people switch off when they're presented with bad news stories. I'm often asked, oh, but what gives you hope? Actually, I think fear is a far bigger motivator than hope. Otherwise, none of us would have insurance. None of us would get vaccinations. I don't actually think it's the bad news that's the problem. I think it's the fact that governments have actively blocked the solutions. We need to hear how bad things are. We owe people like you our gratitude for sounding the alarm, for doing the work that we can't or don't have the appetite to do. We just need our leaders to make it easy for us to do something about it. Would you agree with that?
Look, I absolutely would agree with that. And I think that the thing that really I find most difficult about this conversation is that the solutions that we need to turn it all around already exist. And so we're having this conversation that seems to be going around in circles. And I think that really what I was looking at in the essay was this sort of scientific reality check and asking whether the climate wars are really over. And I also asked the question, or has a new era of greenwashing just begun? But I guess in fairness, I mean, the Labor government has made some progress towards enacting climate policy compared to the previous coalition government. So we've seen things like legislating Australia's net zero by 2050 emissions target, scaling up of renewables, and placing tighter restriction on industrial emissions. But in truth, the federal government's actions really still don't reflect the urgency of this sort of planetary scale crisis that we're facing. And it's been really disappointing to see Labor's continued support for the fossil fuel industry, and also policies that are littered with these loopholes, like the carbon offsetting scheme associated with the safeguard mechanism. Because to be honest, planting a few trees is not going to get us out of the mess we're in. And expecting the land sector to do all of the heavy lifting to reduce our emissions fails to address the root cause of the problem. And we actually know that the burning of fossil fuels is responsible for around 80% of carbon emissions, with the remaining 20% generated from land use changes like deforestation and the degradation of ecosystems. And so we also know that Australia's greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to rise. So it's pretty clear that our climate policies are failing. And so we really, I guess for me, what I really wanted to do with this essay was put this scientific reality check alongside a policy reality check, and then leave the reader. I guess it's good to hear that you were angry, because I also felt angry writing this essay as well. In the past, I've written a lot about my heartbreak. And actually, as I was writing the end of the essay, the Great Barrier Reef was bleaching. The fourth global mass coral bleaching event was unfolding. And for me, I'm just starting to become completely infuriated by the situation. It makes me realize that I mean, what do we need to lose? How bad does it need to get before we actually start doing something that really gets to the heart of the issue, which is really, I know it's difficult, but it is shutting down the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And having said that, well, it's double-barreled and it's also basically getting you to sum up the essay. Having said that, how bad is it? How bad are things? And I'm not just going to get you to leave it there. What has to happen? Like, you've alluded to them. Give me 3 things that the Australian government needs to announce for them to be credibly responding to climate change.
Yeah, and this is a terrific question. So let's deal with the first part first, which is how bad is it? And so unfortunately, I guess I'm here to say that the situation is worse than most people realize. And like I said, I was trying to provide a scientific reality check on the state of the global climate, an update on how we're doing in terms of tracking our the Paris Agreement goals, and also what failure of climate policy means for Australia. And so last year was one for the books. So 2023 was the world's warmest year on record, the warmest in at least 125,000 years. And the conditions were so extreme that it led to really unusual behaviour in the climate system. And it had scientists really worried that we may be seeing the precursors of abrupt climate change in certain aspects of the climate system. And it's actually the reason why I took time away from my scientific research to write this essay, because despite all of the talk, the world is still disastrously off track to stabilise emissions by 2050. And I think some people forget that a lot of these net zero pledges rely really heavily on carbon capture and storage or other offsetting measures. Before I mentioned the carbon offsetting scheme with the safeguard mechanisms to get us to that 2050 net zero by 2050. So it's something I talk a lot about in the essay. But I guess what I want to say right now to the group this morning is that collectively the world is failing to reduce emissions at the scale and the speed that we need to avoid dangerous levels of climate change, which is the overall goal of the Paris Agreement. So the science tells us that we need a 43% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. But if you have a look at the figures that were provided by the global stocktake conducted at COP28 in Dubai last year, it showed that current policies are on track to reduce emissions by just 2% of that 43% that is needed by 2030. And even if we enact all those net zero policies, we're still really looking at 5% reduction rather than that 43%. So really, in other words, under the best case scenario, collectively, we are still not on track to reduce emissions. And as far as I'm concerned, and I sort of say this in the essay, it's a policy failure of colossal proportions. And I guess the implications of that are that right now, there's a 90% chance that the continuation of current policies will see the world warm by 2.3 to 4.5 degrees by the end of this century, with a best estimate of 3.5. So that's current policies. But in a best case scenario where we have all those net zero pledges honoured, we're still looking at warming of between 2 and 3 degrees. So clearly that represents a catastrophic overshooting of the Paris Agreement targets. And it just highlights just how far off track we really are. And again, it's a reality check. 1.5 degrees is likely to be breached as soon as the late 2020s or the early 2030s. So I guess in a nutshell, that's how bad it is. And I guess I detail a lot of the conditions that we experience around the world. And so I won't go into it here, but I encourage you to read the essay. But the second part of your question is a really important one. And I guess it's the thing in terms of what it is that we need to do to turn things around. And I guess the worst thing about this whole situation is that most people don't seem to understand that it's possible to reduce emissions between 50 and 80% using technologies that are available right now. And these are studies that have been conducted by the IPCC or the International Energy Agency and the CSIRO. And so I guess if I had my top 3 in terms of things to do, the first thing we need to do is to stop burning fossil fuels. They are responsible for over 80% of emissions, and they remain in the atmosphere for centuries. And the science tells us that about 60% of oil and gas reserves and 90% of coal must remain unextracted if warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. But as I guess many people on the call, and you certainly know this, Polly, that there are plans for over 100 fossil fuel developments here in Australia, mostly gas projects in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and they're looking to operate for decades to come. And as this essay was going to print, the ALP's future gas strategy came out, which was showing that we're looking at locking in fossil fuel use and infrastructure, they say, until 2050 and beyond, which is entirely incompatible with the scientific reality that we're facing. So I guess that's the number one. The number two is that we need to remove fossil fuel subsidies to give renewable energy a fair go and to allow the industry to develop. So while there has been some good progress made in the areas of like things like renewable energy and supporting green manufacturing, the truth is that we're still heavily subsidising the fossil fuel industry. And so this is where I was reading a lot of Australia Institute work. There have been some fantastic reports that have really shone a light in dark places. And it basically shows that here in Australia, last year, state and federal governments provided over $14.5 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. So that's, again, really incompatible with what the science says we need to do. And why this matters is because what governments do to support polluting industries influences the public and private investment that's going on right now. So if we undermine the transition to renewable energy by locking in fossil fuel-based infrastructure for decades to come, I mean, it's just not a fair fight. So we really do need to see, we just need to remove these subsidies. There's no way around it. So, and I guess alongside that, or an extension of that, is that the government needs to have the guts to put a price on carbon to incentivize the decarbonisation of the economy. So instead of the polluter pays principle, right now the Australian taxpayer is footing the bill for supporting the fossil fuel industry. And that's something that you and I, Polly, have talked about in the past. And when I was trying to get my head around what is failing with policy, it really helped those conversations that we were having. So I think that our leaders need to obviously put a price on carbon and accelerate the clean energy transition, because we know we can be this renewable energy superpower, but most people don't realise that we're actually the sunniest continent on the planet, and less than 15% of our electricity comes from solar. So not only are we blessed with the richest solar and also wind resources in the world, we're still failing. I mean, for me, it's a form of madness. So clearly we don't have our priorities straight, and the fossil fuel industry has a stranglehold on our parliament. So that is really something that has to change if we're really going to get any traction. And the last thing I would recommend is we need to start restoring these carbon-rich ecosystems like forests, and stop logging native forests that have the ability to keep carbon in long-term storage. So once you release that carbon, the genie's out of the bottle there. So I guess there's a lot in that question of yours, but I hope that I've covered the key points.
I think so, yes. Well, it was a lot. What I'm going to do is just summarize, I think, the four things that people are kind of hungry to know what would look like in good policy. So first, we need to stop approving we need to stop doing harm. Okay, tell me if this is right. Stop approving new gas and coal projects. Don't announce a future gas strategy, maybe saying that we're going to be opening new gas basins. Second, stop subsidizing the problem. Stop subsidizing the industry that we are trying to get rid of. Economics is pretty simple. You subsidize and incentivize the things you want more of. You tax or penalize the things you want less of. We're still subsidizing and incentivizing and de-risking fossil fuels. So let's stop doing that. Well, the government should announce if it was having credible climate policy. What was the other one? Oh, okay. This is the penalize or tax the things you want less of. We want less carbon in the atmosphere. So sorry, guys, we're going to have to tax or put a price on carbon. So polluters just have to pay more if they want to pollute. That's a really great way of disincentivizing pollution. It's worked elsewhere. It worked in Australia for a while. The other one is we need to stop native forest logging. We need to stop deforestation, and we need to protect those natural carbon sinks. Not or, like not as an offset, and that's a very big and. So if I summed up the four, it's pretty simple.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's brilliant, Polly. And thank you for your clarity on that. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And unfortunately, we are having this inane debate in Australia about how hard it needs to be and all this sort of thing, where the reality is the solutions exist right now. And as you said in your introduction, this diversion into nuclear power, I mean, I talk about it a bit in the essay, but because it's just so off the wall in terms of, what we need to do right now, I don't think any credible expert would really put forward nuclear power as a viable solution in a country like Australia. So all of that is a diversion. And so, as you just summarised, we do have solutions right now, but the thing that's missing is the political will.
Yeah. But something you mentioned before, was about that overshoot of 1.5 degrees. I want to ask you a question about this because I think in Australia there is a tendency to be kind of flippant. I've just seen a couple of comments there. What's it going to look like at 3 or 4 degrees? I'm not saying the people are flippant, but I don't think we really have a full understanding of how bad that is. So to be clear, the Paris Agreement, this internet between countries who have said they will implement changes in their countries to limit warming to 1.5 degrees of global warming above industrial temperatures. In 2018, the former president of Kiribati, this kind of really nails it for me, wrote an op-ed and he said half a degree of warming may seem trifling, but for my country, Kiribati, these fractional figures are a matter of life and death. Can you explain why it is so important that 1.5 degrees remains our ultimate goal? Like that's what we're going for. I understand under current policies, things aren't looking great, but we need to really, I'll just, why is it so important?
Yeah, and again, a really good question. And it's good to come back to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the goal is to avoid dangerous human interference with the climate system. And so remember, I talked about my motivator for writing this essay was 2023. And, there were some really unusual things happening in the climate system that were really worrying people. So I guess what I wanted to talk about is really that some of the latest research on climate tipping points shows that abrupt climate change is actually possible within the Paris Agreement levels of global warming. So under 2 degrees, we've actually found that it's possible to tip elements of the climate system. So it's possible that right now we've exceeded the tipping point for the world's coral reef systems, which we're already seeing that right now, and also the Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets. And so in the essay, I talk about this, the West Antarctic a little bit because it's really important and I'll explain why. So what happened in the middle of the Southern Hemisphere winter last year is that an area of sea ice that basically the size of Western Australia was just failed to form. It was just missing. And statistically speaking, it was basically 7 standard deviations away from the long-term average, which is a phenomenal departure away from normal conditions. And experts now believe that we may be experiencing the beginning of what they've termed an abrupt critical transition that will result in the inevitable disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And why that's important is that the West Antarctic ice sheet on its own has the potential to raise global sea level by 4 meters. And there's also another 7 meters locked up in the Antarctic. So the problem is that once we melt ice sheets, and this is really what I'm very concerned about right now, and it comes back to your point about 1.5, is that once we melt ice sheets, these changes are considered permanent and irreversible on timescales of tens to thousands of years because it takes that long to actually form an ice sheet. So, and if we're thinking about, the impacts of, say, a low-lying nation like Kiribati and our other Pacific neighbours, if you think about, coastal experts basically have a rule of thumb that for every 1 metre of sea level rise, it results in about 100 metres of retreat in the coastline. And so that's the loss of our beaches, erosion of the coastline. Here in Australia, much of our critical infrastructure, like airports in places like Sydney and Brisbane, are also located in those types of areas. So we're really talking about major disruption, not only to the climate system, but obviously to society. So I guess there's really no more time to delay. There's no more fat in the system. And I guess this is really the thing for me, because right now, when we talk about 1.5, and you and I have also talked about this a lot over last year or so, it is really disturbing to know that right now we are currently on track for that major overshoot of that 1.5 degrees. So according to the United Nations Environment program's emissions gap report, even if all net zero pledges are honoured, there's only really a 14% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. As I mentioned before, current policies have us on track for 3.5. So, you know, but just because we're going to overshoot, that's not to say that we should be abandoning the goal of 1.5. Actually, what it means is that we should be redoubling our effort and trying to understand where and why we are failing. So, and the way I was thinking about it is like, if you had like if you had like a treatable cancer, for instance, like if a doctor said to you, you have a cancer, but it's treatable. So if your mum or your partner or your child had cancer, and the doctor said it was treatable, wouldn't you do everything you possibly could to actually treat it? Or would you just say, oh, well, you got cancer, game over, I'm not even going to try with this? So I guess also just with this medical analogy, the longer you delay, the fewer treatment options are available. So I guess climate scientists are now trying to warn the public that we're facing an emergency situation and we need rapid action. And as you said, and this is one of the key results from the IPCC's report, is that every fraction of a degree matters. So the other thing that's in the IPCC report that doesn't often get talked about is that there are very hard limits to climate change adaptation. So they basically say beyond 2 degrees of global warming, we're looking at conditions that become hostile for much of human activity. And just quickly, the reality of like, say, a 2 degree world here in Australia means that we start to see the beginning of 50-degree temperatures in places like Sydney and Melbourne. By 3 degrees, those sorts of extreme levels of heat become a regular feature of the Australian summer. And if we continue down this high emissions pathway, then we really start to see really fundamental changes. So for instance, Sydney takes on the subtropical climate of Brisbane, and Melbourne transitions to the aridity that's currently experienced in a place like Adelaide. So again, really fundamental shifts in the climate system. And the other thing I talk about in the essay is that, everybody knows about the Black Summer bushfires in 2019, 2020, but under this fossil fuel intensive pathway, they would become average by 2040 and exceptionally cool by 2060. So the stakes couldn't be any higher. And sometimes we forget in a country like Australia, there's so much to lose. And what we do in the 2020s will really make or break our ability to live safely on this planet. And we really only have one chance to get this right. So we can't reverse engineer our way out of it. And I spend a lot of time talking about carbon capture and storage. So probably won't go into it here, but it's not the silver bullet that we need. Actually, the silver bullet exists. It's the political will that seems to be missing. So, I mean, I can talk about this all day, obviously, but maybe I guess I want to let people know that I really believe that the next Australian federal election could be the most important one in our nation's history, because as the third largest exporter of fossil fuels, what we do really matters. And it doesn't just matter, it matters from the moral perspective, economic perspective, and the environmental perspective as well. So we need to take a stand on this because we can get it wrong. And if we get it wrong and we tip the ice sheets, then we are really talking about those irreversible levels of climate change. So that's really what climate scientists like me are trying to say as clearly as possible, so people really truly understand what's at risk, but also the opportunities that are there for us.
So I might just add something to that. To be, you talk about climate change, climate scientists like me, and what we're saying. I just want to make clear to everyone that this is not Joelle's opinion. This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of physics, and climate scientists are the messengers. So often when people like Joëlle speak, they're asked for the solutions and, how do you expect us to turn the lights off overnight? To be clear, no one's ever said that, but that's the response climate scientists get. Joëlle is delivering science. She's delivering fact. She can't be asked what the solution is, because that's not her job, really. The solution is to stop burning fossil fuels and to stop putting it out there. So I just wanted to, kind of really emphasize that, because I think there's a real hunger to know what the answers are, but these are questions that should be directed towards politicians. Unfortunately, when they are directed to politicians, you get a response that is indecipherable about, oh, it's going to take a long time to do this. This is very, we can't rush this, and blah, 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 blah. And it's not an adequate answer, but I'm just saying, because you don't get an adequate answer, then people look elsewhere. I don't blame anyone for that. I do the same thing. It's, will tell me what to do then. So that's not a question. I was just kind of highlighting that to everyone. We're going to turn to audience questions now, but the theme that is coming through from all the questions really is, well, how do we do anything about this? So I will get to individual questions, but this kind of sums it up. And again, Joëlle is a scientist, so she actually doesn't have all the answers. It's up to our leaders to take on the science and then act in our best interests. What can people do? I'm going to throw in my 2 cents, Joëlle, if you don't mind, just because I think it's an unreasonable burden to put on you to say what can people do. But I would read the science, listen to people like Joëlle, get angry. Someone in the chat really nicely said it's time to get determined. We're less than a year away from a federal election now. People, if you want to make change, buy your keep cups, take personal responsibility, stop flying, stop eating meat and all that. But there's a lot of very nervous people in the party room right now who are very concerned about losing their seats. And as my boss, Richard Dennett, says, the things politicians fear most is pain and the threat of pain. And as we've seen with the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts, to Julian Assange being brought home, pressure works. So this is an ideal time now to be putting as much pressure on your local MP as possible, sharing research, signing the petitions that we've put in the chat, report greenwashing. The ACCC responds to a critical mass of complaints. Engaging democratically, we've got no time, as others have said, we're in a cost of living crisis. Engaging democratically is probably the most powerful thing that you can do, and not feeling guilty that you feel powerless as well. Is that fair to say? That, again, that's not a question, but I just want to take the burden off you of having to have all the answers for people.
Thanks, Polly. I appreciate that. I guess it's true. Scientists, we don't have all the answers, but for this essay, I did read over 220 different reports and articles and all that sort of stuff to try and sift through where the answers lie and try and put it alongside the scientific reality. So it wasn't an easy job, but I think it was an important job. And thank you for also noting that this essay is not opinion. It is evidence-based, so we can all have a rational conversation and be on solid ground. So I guess that was really, I guess, what I wanted to do with this essay was provide people with a way of understanding, well, how bad is it? Is it going to get worse? And what can we do? And you touch on, I think, something that is really important, because I do think that, I mean, firstly, I guess it's been really interesting for me to watch this nuclear power conversation play out, because I guess people's level of scientific literacy is really alarming for someone like me. And so I guess it's really makes me think, well, how much do we actually need to understand about the ins and outs of climate science and that sort of thing to do what we know is just ethically and morally right? We know what is causing global warming, right? So we need to just have the awareness around that, and then placing the political pressure on the people that are enacting the policies that run our country. But, it's just sort of like saying, if you had a heart condition, do you need to go off and become a cardiologist to understand every single thing? And I think we've lost a lot of time. And people like me have actually genuinely engaged in that conversation, thinking, well, if I teach people about this, they'll understand. Some people don't care. And maybe that's all right. But we're in a situation now where we need enough people to care that, as I mentioned, we are starting to destabilize the Earth's climate that has been stable for at least 10,000 years in the current state that we're in right now. And it's going to be really hostile to human activity. So there's a lot of, I guess, conversation that goes on that I feel like is a bit of a diversion. So I guess what you're trying to do in this conversation, I can see, is trying to direct us back into what it is that we can do. And I think we just need to be aware of the problem, and we also need to make our vote count. So this is not the time to stay apolitical and on the the sidelines. And that's why people like me, who this is not my usual kind of terrain in terms of engaging in public political conversation, because as a result, that sees people like me attacked, people saying I'm not being objective, and that it's not the role of scientists to weigh into political conversation. That can also be career limiting in terms of being able to secure government funding and so on and so forth. But I'm at the point where I can't, the price of silence feels intolerable to me. And so the people who do know a lot about this problem often don't engage in the public conversation, because it also invites trouble your way. As I found, you become a target, and that can derail your career. So I won't go into all of that, but it's not for the faint-hearted. But I guess what I'm trying to do, and this is why it's, in some ways, it feels like probably the most important piece I might write for some time, is because we as a nation, what we do really matters. As the great work of the Australia Institute has really shone a light on the fossil fuel subsidies and our role as an exporter and what that means. And so I guess it's up to us as citizens to really get behind leaders that really reflect our values of a livable planet and equity, and an economy a green economy that can thrive. And we just have to be prepared to let go of the status quo and realize that the age of fossil fuels has to come to an end, and propping them up with subsidies until the bitter end is only going to lock in warming that will be with us for thousands of years. And I guess that's what is really worrying me, to the point of putting aside my own research, is because once you tip those ice sheets, we are really talking about those irreversible aspects of climate change that keep people like me up at night.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, someone's just in the chat said sorry for asking a policy question. That's not the point I was making. I completely understand that everyone has policy questions, because it is so insufficient what we get from our politicians. So please don't apologise. It's a completely reasonable question. There was something else I was going to ask, but now I've forgotten. It seemed like a good point. All right, we've got so many questions here. A lot of them are on bravery. This is not a question, but I will come back to it. Someone wants to know where they should, there's a theme with all these questions. Someone wants to know where they should be putting their energy now. Do we talk about the nuclear thing? Do we try and debunk that? Do we spend our energy fighting nuclear, or should we be championing renewables? I think you've answered the question, but I just wanted to double check, what are people championing? Should we go back to those 4 things that you highlighted before?
Yeah, I think those 4 items I highlighted before are really important, but I also think there's just a broader, maybe narrative question here, which is that, a lot of climate scientists like me, we can give you the details of, the apocalypse, if you like, but we are less adept at telling good stories about a regenerative future and what it looks like in this era of decarbonising, global economy and restoring ecosystems. I think we need to get better at talking about the benefits of that. So personally, I feel that I would love to see more people engaging in that conversation. So I really think making the really strong case for renewable energy, because right now that should just be able to be shut down very quickly when we're talking about nuclear power, because it's the most expensive form of electricity. We talk about, when I was a 3rd-year university student, I had to take a 3rd-year chemistry course in environmental toxicology, and I learned about DDT and radioactive material. And we're not even talking about the fact that nuclear power also has a significant environmental impact. So the can of Coke thing that's been going around, this is rubbish. And so for me, I almost would just sort of want to just put it aside over there and just focus back on the main thing, which is that, as I mentioned, we have the best solar and wind potential in the world, and yet we're failing to harness that power. So I guess I'd love to see the the case for renewables really emphasized and brought to life and really talked about in an inspiring way, because there have been some social license issues around the rollout of, say, wind farms in places around the country. And it's really disappointing, because maybe we aren't telling a good enough story about people's role in the transition to a clean energy future, and what that means in terms of trying to become more sustainable on the planet. So I feel like maybe we need lots of people doing lots of things, but I guess coming back to the main point is we need to turn the tap off. What is the problem? And the problem is fossil fuel use. So that would be the first thing. But it's also telling better stories and clearer communication around what a renewable future could look like. And also, we talk about the cost of living pressures, but those solutions exist. Imagine if we could have, for instance, policies that were enacted that were we subsidizing, solar panel, rooftop solar for households, and community batteries for areas. And those people like Saul Griffith have been talking about that sort of thing could be rolled out, instead of just giving people, some token amount of money 1 year to deal with it. I mean, there's a lot of common sense solutions, and Polly, you probably know more about that than I do, so maybe you want to comment. But I guess what I want to say there is that I think we do need to be focused on telling a positive story about what a thriving green economy and restoring ecosystems, and the whole concept of, I'd love to also see the concept of caring for country come back into a conversation about, we talk about the economy and we talk about all these numbers and facts and figures, but there's also just this inherent reverence that's been lost for the natural world. And people fail to understand that if we don't have a thriving environment, we can't have a thriving economy. And it's like a credit card debt. We're going to have to pay that off one day. And we have basically, every decision to exploit the natural world has led us to this point of accumulating so much fossil fuel pollution in the atmosphere that we're now altering the way that the ocean circulates and the atmosphere circulates, and the heavy downpours and the more extreme heat. To me, as a scientist, it's phenomenal to think that, we've altered the system that badly. And I guess the reality is that the law of physics will keep warming the planet until we stop pumping carbon into the atmosphere. That's just the reality. So no matter what political spin is put out there, to me, greenwashing and these false solutions is really a betrayal of future generations. And we can do better, and we must do better.
One thing I wanted to come back to there, you were talking, you were saying it hasn't been easy speaking up about this. And that brings me to bravery as a solution. And there's a couple of questions here. Again, I'm just trying to consolidate as many as I can because we've got loads. But I left my job for the same reasons. It wasn't easy. I wasn't rewarded for it. It's made my life quite hard. I was lucky enough to land somewhere where I can tell the truth and speak on behalf of people who can't. Bravery feels like one of the most critical solutions. We can talk about the technology, but centrism is quite literally killing us, and no one wants to lose their job. No one wants to. This sort of brings in the role of democratic reforms like whistleblowing protections and freedom of information and more transparency. But bravery feels critical to me. You've been brave. Sometimes I've been brave. My mum was arrested on the last week for locking on, and someone here's asked a question about groups like Rising Tide who are mobilizing direct action. What do you see the role for A, bravery, and B, those sorts of direct forms of action, recognizing that we are not inciting any, you get it, like any kind of violence, illegal activity, but what are your thoughts on that, if you can speak about it?
Yeah, bravery. Gosh, it's something I've had to really step up to myself in my own career. And I do talk about it in the essays. I won't talk about it here, but it's really difficult. But I guess when it comes intolerable to carry on and not do the thing that is right, well, then you're at a point where you're one of the people that needs to step up and do something, because some people can live with it and there are other people who can't. There's no judgment on that. It's a personal thing. So bravery is also harder in isolation. So it really helps to have community and to have other people around you and people that understand and see you and understand what it is that you're trying to do, because I really think that it's very difficult to go it alone. And so I think the community of people you have around you is really important, whether it's an employer or whether it is a community group or a family or a partner or whatever it might be. And I personally, I would not be where I am if I did not have the support of really, really amazing people close into me, because there was a time in my career where I thought about walking away at a time when I just won this very prestigious Australian Research Council fellowship, and I nearly walked away from it because of the amount of harassment I was getting from climate change skeptics and the freedom of information bullying that was going on. And I felt like, is this really a career I want to walk into? It's so adversarial, and I just want to do my research. I just want to do my work. So Bravery, I guess it's really individual, but you want to be able to look back and say, where was I in the 2020s and how did I show up? Because like I said, the 2020s, it's talked about often, it's the critical decade. It's the decade where we need to turn things around. And so if you're not taking a stand now, well, I don't know whether it's going to make too much of a difference in the 2040s when so that's the first thing on Bravery. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention is that I guess we all have different ways of contributing. So whether it's rising tide, blockading, the largest coal port in the world, I think it is in Newcastle, in a peaceful and inclusive way. I mean, wasn't there like a 97-year-old who got arrested? I thought that was quite amazing. It just goes to show that this is not some activist issue. We're talking about an issue that affects everyone, or those beautiful knitting nanas who just go and sit out the front of MP offices and, just knit and have a non-confrontational conversation with MPs. I'm very inspired by that kind of thing, but we all have different platforms and abilities. So for me as a scientist, I'm choosing to, I guess, stray away from the traditional roles of a scientist. I'm putting my own research aside to write something like this to give people that solid ground. And then I suppose it's about realizing that we're part of this really, really important social movement, if you like, which is to really try and take a stand for a livable planet. And it's just like every other social movement that we've been through in human history, whether it's that fight for gender equality or the abolishment of slavery and all those other really big ethical issues. For me, the fight for a livable future and a stable climate is really the thing, I guess, that keeps me up at night, and it makes me realize this is the issue of our time. This is the thing, because there's so many things vying for our attention, but if we don't have a planet that's stable, then we can't have a healthy economy. We can't have functional societies and all those other things. So I guess it's just realizing the moment that we're living in is actually, historians will look back at this time, and it will be this make or break moment for humanity. So I guess it's just to say that we can all do whatever it is that we can do, whether it's as a consumer, taking your money out of your superannuation, if it's investing in fossil fuels. The federal election, as I mentioned, I think is an opportunity for everybody to have their democratic voice heard and vote for people that reflect your values around a livable future and a thriving green economy. And I guess there's just so many other things I could say, but maybe that's enough.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you. We're getting closer to the end. I'm going to ask a question again. Someone has put this in the comments, but it reflects a few other questions. Has anyone from the government ever asked to meet with you? Has Minister Bowen or Minister Plibersek or Senator Wong ever asked to meet with you, Joëlle?
The answer is no, but I did have a independent senator reach out to me after he read my last book, which was called Humanity's Moment, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope. And he wanted to meet me. So I met with him when I was in Canberra on my residency, actually, at the Australia Institute. And we had this really, deep conversation. And he said basically that he would like me to come and brief them in Parliament House. So I did that a few weeks ago, which was like a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation on the essay, which was a little bit nerve-wracking, as you might imagine. It was not easy, but I just, for the record, wanted to say that the people who showed up with the independents, I was kind of surprised that, I think there might have been a Labor MP there, but I didn't know who it was. And the Greens weren't there. It was really the independents, and I'm not passing judgment around that. All I'm saying is that the people that were sitting there taking notes were the independents, and to me that sort of speaks volumes, I guess, because what was quite inspiring about the last federal election in 2022 is seeing that groundswell of support for independent candidates that aren't being compromised by those traditional party lines. And it's a time for ethics to take a stand. This is not a time for party politics. And I really find it extremely upsetting and frustrating that climate change is being used as a political football. This is not a joke. This is talking about these one-way changes in the climate system. And as I said, we can't reverse engineer our way out of it, despite people saying that we can, that the numbers don't stack up. So I guess I see a role for the bravery of others as well. So, I was really very heartened to see the support from the independent candidates who turned up to the briefing. But as for the actual government themselves, now I'm awaiting an invitation.
Maybe they're watching today. Here's a question. I'm not sure if it's fair to ask you this. Again, pointing out that you shouldn't have to be a policy expert, but it sounds like you might have an answer. I certainly do if you don't. But all right, are the lights going to go off before 2030 without gas? Do we need more gas, Joelle?
No, look, I don't think we need more gas, and I think there is
I don't think. Do we need gas? You're a scientist.
No, we don't. So the CSIRO already have their report where we can get 90% decarbonisation, and basically what unlocks that is renewable energy. So here in Australia, solar and wind are the things that are going to unlock those really deep cuts in emissions. So we don't. They talk about gas peaking plants for those, peak periods, but in fact, I had to sort of look into that. There's battery storage and other things like that to be able to tide us over. But I'm also interested in your view, Polly, because I'm sure you actually have looked at this pretty carefully.
Of course, we don't need more gas. I mean, global gas demand is dropping globally for a start. Australia exports 85% of its gas. So if there's any prospect of a short-term shortage, we've got loads. It's just we're shipping it all off overseas. Our major trading partners who claim to need our gas don't even need our gas. Japan's on selling it to others. They're creating markets. There's been a few questions about demand here, and I suppose, sorry, I've just completely hijacked the question, but questions about demand. Firstly, right, if we were running out of water, we wouldn't say, but people still want to drink water, so we need to find more water. The first thing you'd do is reduce demand for water. You would find ways to conserve water, to make it go longer. So if we did need more gas, which we don't, energy efficiency and trying to find ways to reduce demand, it's not a very sexy policy idea, but we don't even talk about that at all in Australia or globally. The second thing someone's mentioned, if other countries still want to buy our gas, that there's nothing we can do. It's demand that is always going is the problem that can't be solved. But we stopped digging up and exporting asbestos, even though there was still demand. We stopped whaling, even though there was still demand. You can stop things, even though there's still demand. This is a supply and demand issue. And actually, the Australian government is spending far more time creating long-term markets for our gas, going and finding new customers or existing customers to keep selling gas to. The responsible thing to do would be to work with those countries who notionally need our gas on how they can reduce their demand.
Yeah. And can I just add to that? Yeah, great points. And the other thing I would add is that, we talk about gas being, a lower emissions fuel, but it's 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide as measured over a 20-year period. which means that in the short term, we are looking at accelerating the global warming problem by continuing to deal with fossil fuels. And I guess it really comes down to this, ethical argument is we understand that fossil fuels are cooking the planet. We know exactly why that's happening. And so to try and rationalize the continued use of fossil fuels, to me, is unconscionable at this point. We know the science is crystal clear. And so all these other arguments that get made, and someone asked me actually at that parliamentary briefing session I did, they asked me the question about our export partners. And I said, we're smart enough, we need to figure it out. So again, I don't have all the answers, but you guys figure this out. All I'm saying as a scientist is that effectively the equivalent of we have cancer, we need to do something about it. So we can either, try and bargain and try and rationalize a reason why we're going to continue doing the wrong thing. But actually the physics of this doesn't care at all. It's still going to end up warming the planet. So this is why I guess I'm here talking to everyone today. And I'm hoping that we continue to have this public conversation, because we need to get better at thinking about how we deal with this, because there are all these very negative narratives that are out there that undermine the action that we need. And that is we need to be rapidly rolling out renewables like our life depends on it, because it does. And we need to just shut down the fossil fuel industry. And I don't say that flippantly. We've talked about the reason how that could be done in terms of pricing carbon. That's just the reality here. We're just going to have to do that. And so, yeah, the solutions are there, but I guess it's about societally, are we understanding the moment that we're living in? And that's really why I went to the trouble of trying to outline the scientific case of the reality that we're facing, because we can't negotiate and pretend that we can adapt to such high levels of warming, because that's actually delusional, and it's really dangerous to think that we can.
Thank you, Joëlle. That's a great place to end, and we are going to have to wrap it up there. This is it's been a lot for me, but in a good way. I hope everyone else feels the same. Thank you so much. Joëlle Gergis is the Australia Institute's 2024 writer in residence and author of the latest quarterly essay, Highway to Hell. Go and grab it if you haven't read it. Of course, everyone here has. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and your questions and your support. The Australia Institute is fiercely independent. We don't take donations from political parties or corporate partnerships. We really do rely on the support and generosity of people like you who attend our webinars, who amplify our research to power our work. Again, I have to say it, please, if you got something out of today's event and want to help the Australia Institute team keep up the good fight at the front of these important national debates, not even a national debate, this is a fight for our lives, please support us today. And to make sure your gift has the biggest impact possible this month, your donations will be matched dollar for dollar. So every dollar you donate now, you'll be doubling the impact that the Australia Institute can make. Thank you, Joëlle, for everything that you do. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for confronting the hard stuff and synthesizing it so we get the most palatable version. I can't imagine what it's like being in your head and your heart, but you're incredible. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Make sure you subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and our new show, After America. Oh, that's going to be a cracker, hosted by our senior researcher in the International and Security Affairs team, Dr. Emma Shortis. You can find them wherever you find your favourite podcasts. Thanks so much for everyone. This has been really quite special. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.